Welcome to What is Going Om, for new thought from the edge of Om. Each week on OMTimes' flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandie Sedgbeer conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Om. Here is your host, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello. Have you found your God yet? That blunt question, uttered by a well-meaning nurse when a health scare landed New York Times best-selling author Eric Weiner in hospital, launched the former NPR foreign correspondent and inveterate traveller on a far-flung journey across the globe to explore multi-religions in the hope of coming to a personal understanding of the divine and find a faith that fit. A self-confessed spiritual voyeur who was privy to a wide range of religious practices but had never seriously considered these concepts, Eric Weiner's willingness to do anything to better understand faith saw him meditating with Tibetan lamas in Nepal, whirling with Sufi Dervishes in Turkey, unblocking his chi in China, studying Kabbalah in Israel, and enjoying, if that's the correct word, a close encounter in Las Vegas with followers of the world's largest UFO-based religion. And at each stop along the way, he tackled our most pressing spiritual questions. Where do we come from? What happens when we die? How should we live our lives? And where do all the missing socks go? Eric Weiner joins me now to share some of his insights and conclusions from an investigative adventure that was summed up by one reviewer as a whirlwind speed dating of deities. Eric Weiner, welcome.
Thank you, Sandie. Happy to be here.
Eric, in your introduction to your book, Man Seeks God, you wrote that though you were born Jewish, you felt that no off-the-shelf spiritual category seemed to fit you, so you invented one. Tell us about that.
Yeah, we're sort of born into these faiths, many of us are, and, it's like going to a clothing store that has a limited number of sizes, and maybe you're an odd size, and you don't fit into anything. And, we live in an age where we create our lives and our worlds in unprecedented ways, thanks to technology largely. You can create a website in a few minutes and a persona in a few more minutes. But religion somehow is seen as this one thing that you're just sort of born into, and for the most part you're supposed to stick with it. And if you don't stick with it, that's somehow a betrayal to your tradition or to your ancestors. And that struck me as not helpful, not a helpful approach to a life of faith.
So you came up with a category for yourself, confusionist.
Yes, I'm confused, and I think that is okay. That is there are many spiritual teachers who have written about the necessity of going through a state of confusion, and if that you're not confused, it means you're not paying attention. You're not changing. I became interested at one point in chaos theory, which applies to physics and the world of matter. But I think there's a similar thing happens in our creative and our spiritual lives. If you think of a stream running sort of in an orderly way downhill, downstream, and then it'll hit what physicists call a bifurcation point. But in the case of a stream, it might be a boulder. And when it hits that boulder, there's a period of chaos where the stream is no longer organized as a stream, but soon it is diverted on a new course. And it's that point of bifurcation or confusion that often gets overlooked, I think, in a lot of spiritual memoirs or a lot of writing about religion and spirituality, that somehow you're supposed to find your faith, and once you do, you're all set and you're on this journey. But what about just being, confused? So A Confucianist, yes. I also sometimes use the phrase that I borrow from Dave Eagleton. I think that's his name, a neuroscientist. He calls himself a possibilian. And that's also good. But you have to, in order to become a possibilian, you have to be a Confucianist first and go through that state of chaos.
So if you were already confused, why did that nurse's question shake you up so much?
Because she was sort of calling me out on, being in a hospital and even being concerned about your health sort of focuses the mind. Like the hangman's noose, as I believe Samuel Johnson said, focuses the mind. Likewise, a health scare focuses the mind, and you come face to face with your mortality and the fact that you can't just go on being confused forever. And so she looked at me and said, "Have you found your God yet?" And it wasn't so much as an accusation as an exhortation and a call to action. And I decided to try as best I could to answer her question.
So religion and God, contentious subjects to undertake. What I want to know is, how did you sell that idea to your publisher?
Well, here, contentious is putting it mildly. You're at a cocktail party or whatever, and people ask what you're writing a book about. And at least in the circles I travel in, better that you say you're writing a book about the latest sex scandal than to mention the G word, God. Because people go running in the other direction, or they look down at their shoes, or they don't know what to think. There tend to be two types of books in the religious/spiritual sphere. One is books by true believers for true believers, and you know your faith. This person knows their faith, and they're sort of reinforcing a faith you already have. And the second kind of book is by the neo-atheists, people like Dawkins and Hitchens, may he rest in peace, that are taking the opposite end, which is in a way they're by true believers for true believers, but the staunch belief is in non-belief. But again, you're preaching to the choir. There is, I think, a great middle ground, which I occupy, and I think a lot of people do, which is you're spiritually curious, you're an open-minded skeptic, you're in that in between space, and it's a large silent majority, I believe, and I think that's how I was able to convince my publisher to let me go off on this adventure and to publish the book, is that I do think most people fall in that in-between space. And you look at surveys show that, at least here in the United States, the single largest category that's growing all the time when they do surveys about religion are nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. People who, when asked what their faith is or their organized religion, will say basically none of the above. And they don't, to be clear, they're not saying they're atheists or even agnostics. They're just saying that they don't subscribe to any one faith. So I think there are a lot of people out there shopping for God.
I think you're right. The book has 8 chapters, each dedicated to a specific religion. It's estimated that there are somewhere around 4,000 religions. How did you choose which ones to cover?
I was shocked. I see numbers as high as 10,000, depending on how you count what's a religion. And, most people, when you ask them how many religions are, they'll say, 100, maybe 50, or, but people are shocked that there's so many. So choosing was not easy. But I wanted a sort of a geographically diverse and sort of spiritually diverse smorgasbord of religions. So I wanted faiths that came at this question of God and religion from different perspectives, geographic and sort of philosophical perspectives. I wanted ones that were, mainstream. I didn't want to ignore the 3 Judeo-Christian faiths. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and those are in there. But, I wanted to broaden it out. So I included religions like Wicca, like shamanism, and even the Raelians, the UFO-based religion, and to show that there are different paths on this journey, and some of them are conventional and some of them are unconventional, but that doesn't make them less valid.
So you describe yourself as an inveterate traveller. I mean, your love of travel is what, got you into the business to begin with. Did location have anything to do with it, the choice?
It did. So I am a firm believer in the power of place, that where you are affects who you are. And I don't think that's necessarily because of something innate to the place. When it comes to questions like energy vortices, I am an agnostic. I don't come down strongly on one side or the other. I think what place can do for you is it can give you permission to be a different person in a different place. I think that's the real power of travel, is that we're unencumbered. It's not necessarily what we're adding to our lives, but what we're removing. All these social roles that we have to play back home in our jobs, and just the stuff that we're surrounded by in our homes, in our offices all the time. You don't take all the stuff with you on the road. So in a way, you've slimmed yourself down and made yourself more open and more vulnerable to what you experience. So I think that's the real power of travel. And these places, Wudang Shan Mountain in China, Konya, the Sufi sort of spiritual homeland in Turkey, and Tzfat, the city in northern Israel. They're all, they all have history to them as well. And so you go there and you're just more susceptible, in a good way, to what the place has to offer in terms of spiritual teachings.
Mm-hmm. Well, Man Seeks God is a very, very humorous, enjoyable, full of sly humour book, and very informative too. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. I would like to take a little tour around the chapters, if we may, and perhaps you could give us a little highlight of each one. And what you've done is you've summarised, the whole religion in a short phrase in the chapter title. It begins with chapter 1, Sufism, which you titled God is Love. Tell us a little bit about that chapter.
I will. I first want to address the question of humor, because that, as you say, is infused throughout the book. And I try to make fun of myself, but never the faith. And I think that's an important distinction. G.K. Chesterton, a devout Christian and great writer, once said the test of a good religion is whether one can joke about it. And I think that holds true. So I take the religion seriously. I don't necessarily take myself seriously, and I approach them honestly from where I'm coming from. So to segue to your question about the Sufis and love, I had these sort of inchoate, sort of basic understandings of I knew something about Islam, but the Sufis, I knew the whirling dervishes, and that was about it. But then I started to read Rumi and Hafez and some of the other Persian Sufi poets who wrote in Persian, at least, and realized how much it was about love, and how this was a different kind of Islam from the one that in the West we're largely exposed to, or what we think it is. This is mystical Islam, and Rumi is very much a love poet, and he's sort of the patron saint of the Sufi teachers. But he keeps coming back to love of God, love of self, And he did whirl. He was there. Not all the Sufi sects are whirling dervishes, but the one founded by Rumi, they do twirl, and it is a way, like many, like meditation and like Jews who are davening. It's a physical thing you do in order to, and this is going to sound strange, to forget your physicality. You're doing something physical in order to get deeper inside your mind and your soul. So it's a bit of a contradiction.
And what was your experience of whirling like?
Mainly nausea, I would say. There was, and dizziness. It was that. It's not easy. I took some lessons in Istanbul, and it's sort of like dancing. It's hard to get past you have to get past the self-consciousness, and I was able to achieve that for a brief moment. But I'm quoting all these British people because of your accent. But John Stuart Mill, the English philosopher, once he described happiness as something slippery that should be approached sideways like a crab. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that basically once you have that feeling, yes, I'm happy, you're toast, because you're aware of that feeling of happiness, and therefore it slips away from you. And when I had that brief moment of, wow, I'm whirling and I see what this is about and this is pretty cool, it slipped away because I became conscious of it again. And it would, be nice to stay in that state of unself-consciousness. What one great psychologist who just passed away, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, called flow, which you might be familiar with. And yes. A lot of spiritual practices, like the whirling dervishes and doing prostrations, if you're a Buddhist, they're about, I think, entering that state of flow, where you lose your sense of time and you lose your sense of self. Yeah. And that's what the dervishes are doing.
Yeah. So chapter 2, God is a state of mind, that was Buddhism, and you were meditating in Nepal with Tibetan lamas.
Well, actually with Wayne from New Jersey and Tibetan lamas, but I go all the way to Kathmandu and
meet Wayne.
You meet Wayne. Wayne had lived in Kathmandu for like 40 years. He was in a way become Tibetan or Nepali, and was a practicing meditator, and from New Jersey. And I just, that's the thing about quote unquote exotic places and faiths is, we bring our own background to it. We never fully escape that. And Wayne spoke my language, not only American accented English, but the cultural background. He was born Jewish like me. He became a spiritual seeker. Unlike me, he dove very deep into Tibetan Buddhism. So he knew all the craziness, the mishigas, which is a Yiddish word for craziness that's going on in my head. And he was, in that sense, the perfect meditation teacher.
Hmm. What did you experience there? I mean, what was the highlight?
I fell in love with this one place called Bodhanath, which used to be a village outside of Kathmandu, has since sort of been swallowed up by greater Kathmandu. And it is a Buddhist stupa, sort of large, I call it the big white marshmallow, because that's what it looked like to me. And I don't think that's sacrilegious, because, Buddhism is about honoring your honest perceptions. And my honest perception was the stupa looked like a giant white marshmallow. And the mornings there, Tibetans, is a huge Tibetan refugee community living right there in Bodhanath. They will circle the Buddha first thing in the morning, pre-dawn, 5 a.m., and this is before any tourists arrive. And I found just walking around that stupa in this sea of people, people who, may not speak my language, have different backgrounds from me, but we're all equal. We're all walking around this stupa, maybe touching a prayer wheel, maybe not. I found that just terrific. And, there's a whole tradition of walking meditations. And I think it's helpful because you're doing something physical. And those mornings at the stupa of Bodhanath was the highlight of my trip there.
Mm. In Chapter 3, you were in the Bronx. You were with Franciscans volunteering at a homeless shelter run by them. And the title you gave to that is God is Personal.
Yes, because if it's not personal, what's the point? That could probably apply to all the chapters now that I think about it. If it's not personal, it's an intellectual exercise. And I'm very good at intellectual exercises. And but as a longtime journalist, I could play that game where I'm interviewing someone and, briefly entering their world, but not really, right? Because I'm not making myself vulnerable. I'm not doing anything. But Christianity is, it's about a personal relationship with Christ. And I growing up Jewish, I knew next to nothing about the Franciscans, about Christianity. I was, if you're a secular Christian, you just sort of through osmosis pick up more of it. But I didn't have that, so I came there quite ignorant, and I'll say that in a good way, because ignorance is the road to knowledge. I believe you have to acknowledge your ignorance. But they took me in. I stayed with them. They run a homeless shelter there in the Bronx, and they're walking the walk. They start the day with prayer, they end the day with prayer, but in between they're doing stuff. They're running the shelter. They're feeding people. And St. Francis was, and I think, just the most admirable historical figure in Christianity or any religion. And they have nothing. The Franciscans there, they really own nothing. I sort of joke that if you're going to, and they live in a rough neighborhood, and occasionally have been pickpocketed or robbed and had their wallets stolen. If you're stealing a Franciscan's wallet, you're kind of wasting your time. There's not much in there. They don't really have credit cards or except maybe an ID. But they live a life of service, and it's the real deal. And they came. The people I met there, they had stories to tell. They came through lives of drugs and crime, and they found their place there in the South Bronx serving others, and it is personal.
Mm. Chapter 4, God is Far Out. That was your close encounter with Raelism, followers of the world's largest UFO-based religion. I mean, that must have been quite surreal in the midst of all of the other adventures.
Yes and no. So it is an odd faith. I will say that. It was founded, I believe, in the 1970s or a bit sooner, perhaps, by a French race car driver who had an encounter with a UFO in the south of France. And their belief is that we are descended, or created, rather, by a superior race called the Elohim, which created humans some 25,000 years ago, I believe, and that we are that we are put here for one reason, and that reason is pleasure, to experience pleasure. So it flies in the face of a lot of religions which don't place pleasure very high. And I went to their annual conference, which was in Las Vegas, of course. And I'll stop there and say that it is easy to poke fun at religions like this, and I was determined not to do that. but at the same time, to not say, "Oh, this isn't strange." It is strange. I will say that. But I always ask, and this is a question I've learned to ask about whatever project I'm working on: what do they get out of it? And that is important. What did the followers of this UFO-based religion get out of it? And, I met people who seemed perfectly sane, a lot of French Canadians for some reason, former Catholics, you can figure out why, who have joined this faith. They get out of it a lot of what people get out of mainstream Christianity: a sense of community, a common purpose, some organizing principles for an otherwise chaotic world. I think it works for them. The American philosopher William James, writing his great book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, once said that truth is what works. Truth is what works. And what that means is not, so 2 + 2 = 5, that works for me. No, he's talking about another kind of truth, which is, if you don't need to know why exercise is good for you physiologically in order to benefit from it. And likewise, a religion need not be true in the empirical sense in order to be helpful. And I think that's the case with the Raelians and a lot of these religions. They're helpful. They work.
And they also got permission to enjoy themselves.
Yes. And again, not a coincidence that a lot of these people were former Catholics when they felt that the message was pleasure is evil. And they're given permission to enjoy themselves. Now, it was problematic. It made me uncomfortable in a lot of ways. There was more nudity than in most religions. I'll just leave it at that. It was odd, and I could not get fully past the oddness from my perspective to join that faith. But I met one man from, I believe, somewhere in North Carolina who seemed perfectly sane, who just explained to me what he got out of it, and how he recognized it seemed strange, but it worked for him. It was true for him in that sense.
Did you get anything out of it?
Well, it certainly expanded my idea of what counts as a religion and how sort of arbitrary we draw these lines are between a religion and a cult, for instance. Personally, it was fun. I mean, I was in Las Vegas at a convention of UFO-believing pleasure seekers. I mean, I enjoyed myself. I can't say that I had any deep spiritual epiphanies as I did in the other chapters, but if I'm creating this smorgasbord of spirituality, this was the dessert table, and the dessert table is important, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
This was desserts,
Well, we're going to take a short break now, Eric. You're listening to What Is Going On. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and my guest today is former NPR foreign correspondent, writer, and New York Times best-selling author Eric Weiner. And we're talking about his book, Man Seeks God, My Flirtations with the Divine, which chronicles his intrepid adventures across the globe, exploring a variety of religions in the hope of coming to a personal understanding of the divine. We'll be back with more insights from Eric Weiner after the break.
The future of internet radio is here. OMTimes Radio, IOM FM. Being a radio host on IOM FM allows you to build your show on a rich platform with the power of the internet to fulfill your outreach goals and connect with a very specialized and global online audience, unlimited by time and distance. OMTimes Radio will provide you with web relevance, a recognizable conscious brand, and with the standard of excellence that has accompanied every single OMTimes endeavor. Host your show with OMTimes Radio Network.
Vox Novus, the new voice. Vox Novus, the new dimension. Vox Novus, thought and movement leaders who will share from their experience and offer tools to help us navigate our rapidly changing world. My name is Victor Furman. Join me every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio for Vox Novus, the new voice.
Hello, I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes Media's flagship radio show, What Is Going On? And I have a question for you. Have you ever walked through a bookstore and known in your heart that you should have a book on one of those shelves, but don't know how to make it happen? Writing your story and getting your book into print may feel intimidating, but it's remarkably easy and satisfying when you have an experienced professional to guide you. So if you're still striving to connect with your muse, find your authentic voice, formulate your ideas, present your message in compelling prose, publish your book, and build your platform and profile, just imagine what you could accomplish with 30 plus years of experience in writing, editing, publishing, judging, hosting, and resonance marketing to guide you. Maya Angelou once said that there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. If you know you have a book in you, but don't know how to get it out of your head and into the hands of those who are waiting to read it, visit sedgbeer.com, click on the Work With Me tab, and find out how my experience helping others tell their stories might be just what you've been looking for. That's sedgbeer.com, sedgbeer.com.
If I could be you,
and you could be me,
for just 1 hour.
If you could find a way
to get inside
each other's mind.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
We've all felt left out. And for some, that feeling lasts more than a moment. We can change that. Learn how at belongingbeginswithus.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
Welcome back. Eric Weiner. There's 4 more chapters to go. We'll move through them fairly quickly, but in every single title you have God is something. In chapter 5 you say God is nothing, and that of course is a chapter that focuses on Taoism. Tell us about your experience with that.
I really found myself quite taken by Taoism. I went to China, the heart of the birthplace of Taoism, of course, and a mountain and a sort of Taoist retreat that was held in one of the sacred mountains, sacred to Taoism, called Wudong. And I found, again, this physicality, right? We think of spirituality as something that sort of happens in your heart or maybe your head, but Qigong was the practice. And this was a group of Americans and people from a few other countries that had really found Taoism as a spiritual path that's very useful. And, you know, famously, I forgot who said it, but someone once referred to the God-shaped hole that we must fill. The Taoists have a hole-shaped God, in that it is sort of a meditation on nothingness, in a way doing nothing, and considering the fact of a void without it making your skin crawl and making your heart race, because we in the West particularly try to fill up our lives and our houses with stuff and with action. And here is a religion based on this concept of nothingness, which actually infuses a lot of Eastern faiths, that nothingness is not something to run away from. So, and I met a woman named Sandie from Hawaii who was totally into Taoism. It was sort of her guiding principle that got her through like everyday encounters, like being stuck in traffic and sort of just being okay with the fact that there was nothing she could do about the fact that she was stuck in traffic. So, I went to China, but you sort of go to these places and you import the ideas, but the whole point is to bring it home to your everyday life.
Yeah. One of the things that stood out for me, that surprised me, you talked, and I believe it was in China, about certain ancient sites that actually weren't ancient at all, buildings, etc., that had been rebuilt.
Right.
And it wasn't, in fact, the building itself, but the energy of that place.
Yeah, I mean, this was actually something I encountered in Japan, where I lived for a few years.
Japan.
Is I would go to a temple and see it. It said established in 1140 AD. I'm like, wow, it looks awfully new and in good shape for 1140 AD. And then a small little plaque would say, reconstructed 1978. And the American in me was like, oh, this is a scam. They're trying to pass this off as a 1,000-year-old building when it's just 50 years old. It's not a scam. They consider that what is old is the spirit of the place and the spirit of the original building being there. And I think I've been thinking a lot about the power of old places, and where you're speaking to me from in the UK, you're drowning in history. Those blue signs, placards all over London about so and so lived here and slept here, and something in London that's 150 years old is not very old, while here it's, ancient and oldest thing we have. There is something reassuring and comforting and inspiring about old places.
Absolutely. Absolutely there is. What did you take from Wicca?
Number one, you don't want to upset and anger the Wiccans. You want them on your side because they cast spells. Another thing is, again, this notion that what seems strange to us is only because what we're used to. I always believe it's the writer's job to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar. And so in talking to witches and people who practice Wicca, always asking what do they get out of it. And, the bottom line is this connection to nature, this pagan faith that predates Judeo-Christian religions and that we've incorporated into Judeo-Christian practices,
Yes.
but is about this connection to nature, which, if you think about it, makes a lot of sense, and I don't know why this is considered strange. Right now, you see this return to nature. You see all this research, scientific research done into what a friend of mine wrote a book called The Nature Fix, which documents how nature is good for you. And that's essentially what the Wiccans are doing, reminding us that nature is good for you and developing these practices and these rituals for reconnecting with nature. And unfortunately, they say that, history is written by the victors, and Christianity, having decimated, not fully wiped out a lot of the pagan faiths, was able to paint them as barbaric and primitive. And that's unfortunate.
You wrote a piece, I'm going to read it out. You said, every religion has its creation story, and the Kabbalists are no exception. Theirs is as colourful and fantastical as any I've encountered. Basically, it says God dropped the universe. He was creating it when, oops, the piece is shattered. We're now living among these shards, and it's our duty to repair the world, to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. How do you think God would think we are doing with that?
In progress, he would say. You were speaking about there essentially the Jewish notion of tikkun olam, which means to repair the world. And I think we're doing better than the news might lead you to believe. I was a journalist, and I'm not anymore, and I realize now the extent to which bad news tends to dominate. So it's easy to look around at the world and what's happening and say we're doing a terrible job. The world is falling apart. But, there are 10,000 acts of kindness happening around the world right now as we're speaking that are not going to make it into the newspaper or the television or a website. They're not considered news. So I actually think we're doing better on the repairing of the world than a glance at the headlines might lead you to believe, but we obviously have a long way to go.
Well, I'm sure people will notice that I've kind of skipped chapter 7 and chapter 8. We don't have time, but the titles of those, the Wiccan chapter was God is Magical. Chapter 7, which was on shamanism, is God is an Animal. Excuse me. Chapter 8, Kabbalah, God is Complicated. What's God to you now?
I've devised what I call an Ikea God, some assembly required. And I'm not very good at putting together Ikea furniture.
There's always a piece missing.
There's a piece, well, you think it's missing, but the instructions are just schematic or in Swedish, and I'm not good at that. But why not construct your own faith out of the bits and pieces? I do think, like a piece of IKEA furniture, you need a foundation. There needs to be a foundation. And for me, that's still Judaism, but my own brand of it. But you can have a Jewish foundation that has Buddhist bits and pieces and a Taoist, sofa covering or whatever it is. I think you have to limit the number of pieces. I'm stretching this IKEA metaphor to the breaking point, so to speak. But, you can't have 20 different pieces. I think that's too many. But, I begin my day or end my day with a breathing practice called the Sudarshan Kriya, which is a Hindu Vedic yoga breathing practice. I might on Fridays I typically observe the Jewish Sabbath, and I have other aspects of me that are borrowed from these different religions, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. The challenge becomes in having a community, because if we're each creating our own religion, then we're just atomizing ourselves and isolating ourselves. And a big part of religion, not the only part, is that sense of community. I wrote a book on happiness, and called The Geography of Bliss, and one thing I discovered there is that religious people are happier than non-religious. This is just statistically true all around the world and in over time. And the question that researchers have yet to figure out is why that is. Is that because of the sense of community? You belong to a church or a synagogue, so you have the regular sense of community, or is it something deeper than that? I think it's deeper. I think it goes to the point of meaning. And community plus meaning is what makes for a quote-unquote good religion.
Well, throughout Man Seeks God, you kind of refer to yourself again and again as being a bit of a curmudgeon, someone who's a bit depressed, someone who's not really that happy. Did you emerge from this adventure happier?
No, but I care less about my happiness. And what I mean by that is I think happiness is the wrong objective. Again, John Stuart Mill says happiness is best approached sideways like a crab. Trying to be happy is a recipe for not being happy. And there is something greater than happiness, at least as we define it today. The ancient Greeks had a word, eudaimonia, which is often translated as happiness, but it's much bigger than that. It was flourishing or a meaningful life. And religions are not about making people happier. in fact, I think people are drawn to religions that are hard. I think they want challenges. Meditation is not easy, and that's, I think, a big part of its appeal. People want meaning. So I'm not happier having written this book and sampled these religions, but I find my life has more meaning, and I find I care less in a way about whether I'm having a good day or a bad day, or whether I'm happy at any one particular moment.
Mm. Well, those 4 most pressing spiritual questions: where do we come from? What happens when we die? How should we live our lives? And where do all the missing socks go? Did you find answers to any of them?
All except the last one. I still can't figure out where the missing socks go. I think that's just destined to be one of the great mysteries of mankind. That was a joke, Sandie. But
I understand that.
Yes, okay. It's hard to tell. British people laugh on the inside. It's hard to tell. So
it's true. It's true.
I would say that those questions, I realize I sound like I'm dodging these questions, but I'm not. They don't matter as much as you think. That it is. I don't think it's necessarily religion's role to provide those answers. I think it's to allow us to live with the inadequacy of those answers, that we may not know those things, and that religion can provide you a framework for a meaningful life without answering in a scientific way, where did we come from, what happens when we die. And I think if religion cannot answer those questions, it doesn't make it less worthwhile. And I think that, the word orientation comes to mind, that religion is about an orientation to life, a direction. And think of ourselves as like satellite dishes, and we're pointing in one direction. And religion doesn't change the shape of our satellite dish necessarily, or the size of it, or even its sensitivity, but it redirects it in a different direction. To convert comes from the word to mean to turn. So when you're converting to a religion, you're turning. You're not transforming yourself. You're turning your direction a bit. And, in a way, it doesn't matter necessarily which direction you turn or what shape your satellite dish is. The point is simply that you reorient yourself. You discover, just like in all great works of literature, the question of what if life were otherwise? And to me, that is the purpose of religion. What if life were otherwise? It's expanding your sense of possibilities, making you a true possibilian.
Yeah. Well, I think man's a problem-solving animal, and really we don't want answers to all of the questions and the problems, because then what would we do? We need a purpose.
Right, but we because we live in such a technological age, don't you think we feel like if we don't have all the answers, that somehow that represents a failure of either science or religion? And but why? Why? Who says we have to have all the answers? And maybe one role of religion, this thought just occurs to me now, is not to provide answers, but to provide the ability to live with the lack of answers, and to be okay with that, and to not stay up at night gnashing your teeth and freaking out.
Well, I definitely agree with that. I mean, I always used to drive myself crazy thinking I've got to know it all before I die. And I used to get very frustrated about that. But now I'm at an age where I think, you know what, I know enough. The rest of it...
Right. And there's knowing and there's knowing. There's the book knowledge and there's intellectual knowledge. It's like you could know a lot about wine. You could say you were an expert on wine and you studied its origins and the different vintages. but you've never had a glass of wine, right? So if you have a glass, you could have one glass of wine, and that person would then, in a way, know more about wine than the person who wasn't a quote-unquote expert on it. So there's knowing and there's knowing, if you know what I mean.
Your last book was The Socrates Express, In Search of Life Lessons from Dead Philosophers. That was published in 2021. You do like these kinds of interesting questions, don't you? And I love the way that you then create a great adventure for yourself around them. But tell us, what was the most important lesson that you learned from the dead philosophers?
From Socrates himself, all philosophy begins with wonder, and the importance of that, and how we are, we're not thinking machines or problem-solving machines, we're wondering machines or wondering beings, and how to simply ask, to approach, let me put it this way, approach the world from a perspective of wonder, which has an element of curiosity, or why is that so, but also a sense of awe. And I think that's what motivated all the 14 philosophers in my book, was that sense of wonder. And, it's been said that a philosopher is a 7-year-old only with a bigger brain, and I think that's very true. And we've got the big brain parts, but we've lost touch with that 7-year-old part that's curious about everything and asks questions about everything. So my takeaway is all philosophy begins with wonder.
What's your next book going to be about?
A bit different. I'm working on a book about one person, about Benjamin Franklin. And about the fluidity of his life and about our lives. He was, a little-known fact about Franklin is he was an expert swimmer, and when he was a young man visiting London at age 20, could swim across the Thames River, which was wider back then, 3 miles, doing all kinds of tricks. And so I'm going to, I don't know how to swim. At my age, I'm going to learn how to swim and have a parallel story of Franklin and what he can do about, you talked about repairing our world, about what he teaches us about repairing our world right now.
You do writing workshops. You founded the Himalayan Writers Workshop, which takes place on the roof of the world, Bhutan. Why Bhutan?
I love Bhutan. I wrote about it in my first book, The Geography of Bliss, and look, they have a policy of gross national happiness. Kind of says it all,
Yeah.
And that's in October. Write to me if you're interested. It's a magical place, probably the closest we have to a real-life Shangri-La, although they hate that comparison because it sets the bar high from them. But it is a magical place. And they, gets back to that question, what if life were otherwise? What if we measured progress not by gross national product, by gross national happiness? You've got to love a place that comes up with that.
So do you love it enough to consider living there?
No. I've lived overseas for a decade. I lived in India, Jerusalem, Tokyo, and I enjoyed it. And now I'm home. The Dalai Lama is often approached by spiritual seekers who want to convert to Buddhism or move to Kathmandu, and he often will tell them to grow where you're planted. And I think there's some wisdom to that. And the point of all my books and all my travels is not to pick up and move someplace else, but to import these lessons from abroad, incorporate them, and bring them home. So I'm happy to sit here with my dog Parker in my home office and do my travels, but always come home.
One last question before we close. You have described yourself as, for some reason, which I don't think you've found the answer, a collector of bags. If you are going to do any less travelling, do you have any use for these bags? Are you still going to go on collecting them?
Are you in the market for a bag, Sandie?
Well, I think they're all canvas bags, aren't they?
Yeah. Yeah, I own about 50 or so bags, shoulder bags, backpacks, etc.
That's more than most women. You know that, don't you?
Yeah, but just one pair of shoes, okay? So, I think I've thought about this, I've written about this. I think my bag collection, my bag interest, I don't call it an obsession, others do, is an attempt to contain my life. And I just love when it's just got the right number of pockets and it feels right on your back and you've got everything you need but nothing extra. Sometimes I walk around the house with a bag, and my wife finds that odd. I'm not giving the bags away, and even if I travel less, I still need something to carry my laptop to the coffee shop to do my writing and to carry my books. So
you can keep the bags.
Yeah, I'm keeping the bags. Thank you.
Yeah, I do, and I do relate to that. Just having the right number of pockets. Well, that's it. We're out of time. Eric Weiner, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sandie. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Eric Weiner has been discussing his critically acclaimed book, Man Seeks God, My Flirtations with the Divine. Check out his website, Eric Weiner, at books.com, and learn about his other books, his writing workshops, and sign up for his newsletter. You will not live your life unamused. That brings us to the end of this week's show. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and I'll be back at the same time next week with another edition of What Is Going On. Till then, it's goodbye from me.